Okay, so my dear students, as I mentioned, primary data means the data which is available on the first hand, and the secondary data is the data which is available on the internet. Okay, now if you are collecting data through interviews or through questionnaire, okay, that is primary form of the data, and most of the cases you are using primary data. Okay, you are not using secondary data. There is a common mistake which I saw in all your friends' proposal. They are saying that we are using both primary and secondary. Yes, you can do in some research. You can do both because we can do mixed method research. Yes, but if you are taking interviews and analyzing those interviews, you are taking primary data, not secondary data. No matter you have used research articles for a literature review or anything else. So literature review or the problem statement, that is not part of your data. Okay, that is just for your understanding. Data is something you are analyzing. Remember, you are trying to analyze that. Okay, you do some process and give the output based on that process. So that is called data. Data is not just something you use one statement from one research paper and told me that this is the secondary data. No, this is not a secondary data. This is your support, your evidence of your claim. Okay, that is not secondary data. So secondary data may be the annual reports if you are using them. For example, in financial research or in the economics research, we use statistics based on the government policy or all this data which is available. So that is called secondary data. So try to analyze which type of data you are using. In most of the cases, we are using primary data, not secondary data. Okay, is it clear? So in our case, either we are doing qualitative or we are doing quantitative research. We are technically using primary data. Okay, so the primary data is directly interacting with the respondents and collecting the feedback. Okay, that is very simple. This is our primary data. Okay, clear? So you cannot mention that both because you are not using both. You are using only primary data. No matter you are using research articles and already published material for your literature review or your problem statement or research design, but still that is not considered as data. Okay, so the data is something which you analyze. So you will do interviews or you will collect data through questionnaire in order to analyze your data. So that is purely a primary data research. Okay, this point is clear. So can I move on? So primary and secondary, the difference between these two is clear, right? So the primary data is something which we collect first hand directly from the respondent, but on the other hand, secondary data is something which is already available on the internet, and we use that pre-existing data and analyze it for our research. Okay, for example, annual report, for example, other different types of the research reports or economic data, statistical data available online. Okay, all these are basically your secondary source of data. Okay, so our research is mainly primary data. Okay, clear? So let's move on for today's topic, which may be a very important concern for all of us, which is how we can collect data using interviews. Now, when I talk about primary data collection, I told you there are two methods of collecting primary data. What are these two methods? The first one is basically we have two methods to collect primary data in our case. Either we go for interviews or we go for questionnaire, right? Okay, clear? So we can collect data, primary data, mainly from two sources. Either we go for interviews or we can go for research questionnaire. As I mentioned in the previous classes, uh, questionnaire is also a form of interviews, but that is basically a structured interview. I will explain later in this lecture, but remember Data collection can be done through the primary sources, and this primary source can be interview or it can be research questionnaire. So today we are going to talk about the interviews. Very important topic, and if you see, this important topic is very much concern for those who are doing qualitative or interview based research. So I assume all of us, or we shall assume that all of us are doing qualitative research. Okay, for example, just consider yourself as a qualitative researcher now. So you have to conduct interviews. So you are being assigned for a interviewer, as an interviewer for an interview based research, and what type of interviews you can do and how you are going to conduct that interview. So this is the point for today's class. I will make it very brief and quick, and then we will go for question answer session. So there are three different types of the interviews, okay, what we can conduct. Basically, semi-structured, structured, or unstructured interview. Okay, so usually, uh, what is an interview? An interview is a purposeful discussion between two or more people. That is a simple definition of interviews. But what we need to do is we need to find out the purpose. We need to find out the information. We need to collect the information from the interviewee. So that is what we need to do in our research. For this reason, we need to plan that interview very well, because if we do not plan that interview, we cannot get the right information which we need. Okay, so because the purpose of the interview is very simple, we need to collect information. Okay, the relevant information, not just information, the relevant information about which we are going to talk. Okay, so there are three major categories of interviews: unstructured, semi-structured, and structured interviews. So here they mention only two, but in next slide I'll show you these are basically three types of the interviews. Okay, now if I talk about this slide is very, very important, how to conduct those interviews. So now if you are on the side of semi-structured or unstructured interviews, that are called non-standardized interviews. Okay, but if you go for structured interview, very much predefined interview, that is called standardized interviews, and these are mainly called questionnaires. Okay, so this is basically the next chapter I will teach you in a while, but this chapter requires for only for questionnaire based research. Okay, so that is something different. So what we are focusing today is non-standardized interviews. Okay, so non-standardized interviews are basically two: unstructured and semi-structured interview. What are these? I will explain in a while, but how we can conduct those non-standardized interviews? There are two important methods: either one interviewer and one interviewee. Most of the cases, what we do one to one. This is called one to one interview. Or we can do one to many, very simple. So one interviewer and there are many interviewees, more than one interviewees. Okay. So how we can do that? Either we can do face to face, either we can do through telephones, either we can do through internet, and now we have these Zoom and other software through which we can conduct interviews very easily over the internet. Okay, one to many is also in the same method. We can go for group interviews or focus group discussions through the face-to-face method, or we can go for internet-based methods of conducting interviews. Okay, so face-to-face, you can do it telephonic, or you can do it internet based methods of doing interview. Okay, so you can do one to one or you can do one to many. One to many mean focus group discussion is one part of that interview method. Okay, clear? So this point is clear. Can I have your answers please, if you are listening, and reply to me any question if you need to ask. As usual, I assume there would be no question, but still my task is to ask you questions. Okay, so if you have any query, any question up till now, you can ask me. Otherwise, we move forward. May I have your answers, please?
No question होता.
Okay, good. So things are clear, right? Okay, let's move on for the next point. So I believe we understand that there are different categories of interviews. Either we can go for structured, which is standardized interview, and that would be discussed in the next chapter. I will explain it later on. But for unstructured interviews, we have different types of the methods. We can go for one-to-one or one-to-many. Okay, we can conduct face-to-face or online or telephonic interview. So this is the main task for the interviews. Now let's talk about the types of the interviews. As I mentioned, there are three different types of the interviews. Okay. Now, what type of interview you are going to select is depending on your research design. Very, very important thing to understand. Okay. So it depends on what type of research you are planning to do. Okay, so what type of research we can do is depending on your research onion. Remember that the research design we understand based on the research onion, different layers of your decision making for research design. Okay, so that is the main point from where you can understand what type of interview are you going to do for your research. Now there are three important categories of interviews. Structured interviews are those types of the interviews where you have clearly identified questions, okay, what we need to ask, and the options are also clear to you. What options uh, the respondent can select. Okay, so the questions and the responses, so you can give them the option and they can reply you any of these multiple choice questions or one more than one choice or whatever the type of the questionnaire is, but you have predefined questions. Okay, so that is called a structure. Can I have your answers, please? Clear? Okay, if the concept is clear, can you tell me what type of research is required for which type of the interview? So, sorry, which type of interview can be done in which type of research design? Okay, so now there are three research designs. Remember, explanatory research design, explanatory, okay? Explanatory research design is more toward the explanation of the relationship or of the phenomena or anything. So if something is already happened, we want to explain why and how it happened. Okay, so this is more on explanatory in nature, means the relationship between two things. What is the relationship and how this relationship is being developed, something like this. Okay, so this explanation is called explanatory research. Okay, clear? Very simple. Descriptive research is very simple, and this is what we do mostly in quantitative research. Okay, so descriptive research is just to figure out the relationship, whether the relationship exists or not. Okay, so there is common relationship between these two or three phenomena or two or three objects. So that type of research is called descriptive research, where we always pose an hypothesis and then these hypothesis needs to be confirmed. Okay, so descriptive research is basically to confirmation of your hypothesis, or it is a confirmation of relationship between two or more variables or objects or phenomena or events. Okay, clear? Now, on the other hand, the exploratory research is to explore something very new. We explore new knowledge, we generate new knowledge, we explore the things which just happen or are going to happen. We don't know exact information about that. So that type of research is called exploratory research. So we are trying to explore. When we are trying to explore mean that you don't have a lot of prior information. You don't have a lot of already existing information. Okay, so this is called exploratory research. You are going to explore. Explanatory research is talking about something happened, but we want to explain why it is happened. Okay, and the descriptive research is the confirmation of the relationship or mostly testing the hypothesis. Okay, so that is the descriptive research in nature. Okay, so clear. Now if you see this chart, from this chart you can determine which type of interviews are required for which type of research. Here it is very clear, structured interviews are more appropriate for descriptive research. Okay, when the research is descriptive in nature, you can go for structured interviews. Okay, and you can do it for explanation also, but not very much common. Okay, but the common is in descriptive type of research. Okay, semi-structured interviews are very much useful in explanatory research. Somehow some people they use it in exploratory research also, but mainly they are meant to be done in the explanatory research. Okay, and finally unstructured interviews are very much efficient in or effective in exploratory research where you want to explore new knowledge. Okay, so this is how different types of the research interviews are being formed and how we can do that. Okay, clear? Any question here? If things are clear, please everybody should type your answer clear, and if you have any question, I would happy to take that question. So please give me your answer. This is something really amazing. You are always clear. Okay, let's move on. Okay, now if we are clear about these different types of the research questionnaire strategies or interview strategies, we shall understand we need to plan. We need to plan in order to conduct that interviews. Okay, interviews are not simple. We have to see a lot of different things, a lot of different aspects that you need to understand during the the process. Okay, so preparedness is very important aspect of this uh, interview process. So remember, when you are doing interviews, you should be clear about the purpose of the research. You should very briefly explain what is the purpose of that research that needs to be done and explain to the interviewee also. So they should be able to collect that information and pass it to you in their mind, which is basically relevant to the topic. So please, when you start interview, when you do interview, when you plan for any interview, briefly explain the purpose of your research. So that interview need to be connected with that purpose of your research. Okay, and then you need to establish personal contact. How we do that? We start very informal questions, or maybe greeting each other, maybe discussing about the weather, maybe discussing about their hobbies, maybe discussing about some common points where they feel comfortable to pass on information to you. Okay, so that is very important point. So you have to establish a very clear personal contact with the interviewees. Okay, so that is very important. Now, the nature of data collection question is very important. There are different types of the question where, as I mentioned, there are direct questions, there are indirect questions, there are probing questions. So you want to ask direct question and then probing question. Probing questions are to digging more in detail into any subject. For example, I ask you a direct question: would you like to play soccer? Now you say yes. Now, after this yes, I will go for a probing question. The probing question means that I am going deep or dig more into that. Okay, what do you like in soccer? Where you want to play? Now, these types of the questions are probing questions. So you can start with the informal, simple question and then go with the probing question. So the collection of questions, what type of questions you have, you should very much clear about that. Okay, and you should written, and you need to do that work prior to your interview. What type of question you are going to ask, when you are going for probing question and when you are not going for that. So that should be very much clear to you, and there should be a strategy for mixing all different types of the question in your research interviews in order to collect the right information. Okay, that is very, very, very important. Okay, now your time, you must need to tell the interviewees, or you need to work on this, how much time is required. Usually a 30-minute interview is sufficient for semi-structured interview, but if your questionnaire or if your questions are unstructured, then it might be take more than that. So that you need to decide what type of question you are asking and how much time will it take for complete that interview. That is important point. Okay, and then you need to understand how much time you can spend to complete that process. So that is very, very important planning matter when you are talking about any interviews. Okay, clear? So these 4 points are very, very important, but there are some important concerns when you collect information. There are some concern always. It is not just for the interviews, but it is also for all type of data. You should have some concern about the reliability, validity, and correctness of the information. These all are very important concern in all data types, not just for the interviews, but obviously you need to consider whether your interview is reliable or not, dependable or not. So what is reliability? Mean the information is correct, information is usable, and information is dependable. So you can make decision on that information. That is dependability. Okay, so if you cannot make those decisions based on this information, there is no purpose for doing that interview. So dependability and reliability is very, very important in the research interviews or the data collection. This form of bias. Now, please consider these points not just for interviews, it is all for all data type, but in the interviews, it is more frequent, the form of bias. Interviewer bias, the respondent bias, the time bias, there are many forms of biasness. Why? If I have a particular interest, then my interview would be different. For example, the soccer. If I am a soccer player, that interest might influence my interview during that process because I have self-interest in that game. On the other side, if I don't, then might be my lack of interest also a form of bias. So we need to be neutralized, and we need to see whether we can conduct this interview without bias. So that we need to train ourselves. But the same thing happens for the interviewee also. They might have their personal preferences, interests, and choices, and these preferences, interests, and choices may be affecting your interview. So you should be able to detect that bias during the interview because you should train yourself on that. There might be a cultural difference if we are doing interview or we are conducting interview with an American person. It is entirely different than if you are conducting an interview for an Indian person or for a Malaysian person. So these things are different because the cultural differences are there. There are many things which are acceptable here and not acceptable in the other countries. And similarly, many things they are acceptable in other countries but might not be acceptable here. So that culture form largely the way you think, and that is important in order to clarify, or in order to conduct a clear interview. You should understand these cultural differences. That's why you need to read your respondent, or you need to read your interviewees before you meet them. Okay, you need to understand them. You need to check their profiles in order to understand a little bit about their cultures and all this. Okay, now generalizability and transferability. Basically, when we conduct interview, the purpose is to make decision or make solutions for that problem that can be generalized. For example, if we conducted interviews for 10 to 15 people who were suffering from coronavirus disease, so what was happened, we were trying to figure out what common practices we can do in order to prevent from this disease or this virus. Okay, now from that we learned, okay, we need to keep 1 meter distance, we need to wear mask, we need to stay vigilant, and should use this what is it, it's called this disinfectant, or uh, what we are using most of the time now, what that liquid which basically kill the virus, what is the name? Anybody can tell me? No, no, I'm not talking about the virus. I'm talking about the liquid we are using to uh, e- means it to prevent virus from spread in the most of the places. That disinfectant.
Sanitizer.
Yes, yes, yes. Sorry, the mostly heard word, but I forget. Sorry, sanitizer. So hand sanitizers are being used. So that what we learn from a few people, and then we generalize it, because that generalization is on the large population, so everybody is using that prevention. Okay, so that is how we generalize our result. That is the purpose of interviews. Okay, so we collect information, and from that information we generalize the results. So that is how we need to understand our interviews should be. So generalizability should be there, and the validity and credibility is also part of the data quality. Validity means will it be valid for 2 3 years, or the information is valid for longer period of time or shorter period of time. The interview is valid, or the information you are collecting is valid or not. Okay, so maybe some incident that happened in the past, they may not be valid today, and you are collecting information from a person who was suffering that disease in 1990. Now it is not the point where you want to collect that information, because it is already past, it is not valid now. So you need to see whether your information is updated and valid and credible for today's world. Okay, so that is it. The quality of your interviews is very, very important, because the data you are collecting through the interview will reflect in your results, and your results would be generalized, and other people are going to get the benefit from that. That is the purpose of research. So if your interviews are not valid, that results may not be valid or generalizable to a larger population. So that may not be a good idea to conduct interviews. Okay, so clear? So data quality is always an issue, and these are some of the main concern for the data quality: reliability, dependability of the interviews, biasness, cultural differences, generalizability, transferability, validity, and credibility. These are the concern which every researcher should understand and do something about it before starting interviews. Because once you have the data, it is very difficult for you to change that information or to do something about that. So that is why we say prior planning prevents poor performance, 5 P's. Okay, so that is why we need to do all prior planning for conducting an interview before we conduct it. Okay, so I believe that is it for today's lecture. Now you need to understand, if you are doing questionnaire based research, you should follow the questionnaire, standardized questionnaire, which is the next lecture. Okay, but what I'll do, we will not take that lecture next class. We will take that lecture in this week class also. So I will record that lecture and share it with you, so you can learn for the questionnaire also. So you can complete your class activity. Now the class activity means your research proposal. Okay, so research proposal is up till your questionnaire. Okay, so if you have questionnaire, you can complete your research proposal and submit it to me before 31st of December. Okay, so that is it for today's class. So today's class was mainly on the data collection, primary data collection using interviews. And interviews, I told you, they have 3 different types: unstructured, structured, and semi-structured. And these types of the interviews are being used in the different research design. If your research design is descriptive in nature, mainly hypothesis testing, you can do for structured interviews. But if you are talking about the exploratory research, you need to do unstructured, and explanatory research need to be done with the semi-structured interviews. And all interviews having different form of objectives and a few points which you must need to clear or confirm while you are conducting interviews. For example, you should clearly define the purpose of your research, create a personal or informal interaction with your interviewees. Okay, and then you should understand what type of questions you are asking and how you are going to conduct that with respect to the time and completeness of the interview. So these are the concerns. And then the quality is another important factor. So that is why you need to understand whether the information you are collecting is reliable or not, it is generalizable or not, cultural differences were included or not. Okay, so all these points are very, very important in order to plan for your interview, not for your interview, for collecting right data and accurate data for your research. So that is why we call prior planning prevents poor performance. Okay, and I believe all of you, those who are doing qualitative research, they would be prepared before conducting interviews so we can prevent poor performance. Okay, I think that's it for today's class. Please make sure I have already recorded this lecture and I will try to share it with you as soon as possible. So make sure you learn this lecture again and apply it on your research if you are doing qualitative research. Okay. For those who are doing quantitative and they need to develop research questionnaire, I will record that lecture and pass it to you before the, next week class, because the next week class would be on data analysis, not a proposal stage. Okay, so that is why one lecture which we skipped in the past, I will just send you the video of lecture 11, so you can watch that video and learn about the research questionnaire. So we will be back on the track after this lecture. Okay, so this lecture is concluded and the next lecture would be given to you within a few days. Okay, now if you have any question, the forum is open for questions. Otherwise we can just leave or close the session. Okay, if there is no further question, let's just close the session, and I hope so we can complete our research proposal before 31st of December. Okay. So thank you very much.